Halcyon torpedo gunboat at 1/350 scale. In real life, she was 262 foot overall. That translates in the model as being 9 inches long overall. She was powered by steam turbines, which could achieve 20 knots, and thereby was twice as fast as the rest of her 5-ship class, named the Dryad class. She was armed with 5 times 18-inch torpedo tubes and 2 4.7 quick-fire guns on deck. Here is the model. My thumb and fingers should give you an indication of the size. Now, unlike Nigel, who was doing supreme woodwork, unlike our man Ian, who was doing also supreme woodwork under arduous conditions, this model is actually a relief model for the ridiculously complex small scratch-built model of the Rattan, which that featured in one of the earlier Zoom sessions. So this is a really awful small run resin kit, which was dimensionally correct on the hull, and just about everything else was discarded. Just how I like it. The ship is festooned with an enormous amount of cowl vents, and they're a very distinctive feature of this vessel. Now, the cowl vents that were cast were in outline correct, but in detail awful. I started with drilling up from the bottom very carefully, and then hollowing out from above, and so as to get a near scale thickness of the cowl mouth, which has a bead ring around it. The writing on the picture, which hopefully is visible, should explain. By putting the ring on the apex edge of the eye, just slightly outboard of the actual dimension, I could then carve all the resin away, leaving I think it's about a 0.04 ring of metal wire. The tools needed for such a job, you can kind of get an idea of the size of the operation. I basically use various drill bits to drill up, in, and enlarge slowly. Resin is a forgiving material in terms of precision of cut, but it is also inherently easy to fracture. And here we can see the writing still visible, and you can also see the end effect. Now, forgive me for a moment, but I'm going to describe to you certain salient ways of doing things on this model, because you guys are all exceptional model ship makers. So the actual boring bits of sticking things together and making eyebrows and all that, I'm going to bypass. I'm going to do the stuff that most people normally wouldn't see being done. You'll notice that I've mounted the cowl vent on a push pin, and that will also give a sense of scale. The funnels. The real thing had great big cowls on the bottom of the funnels. The originator of the awful resin kit, they are now completely defunct, no surprise, actually did not study the photos, albeit they studied the plans. The plans on the earlier ships, they had no cowls. To make this cowl is actually a surprisingly difficult operation. So I formed a square of wire and then put a ring above it. Now, that doesn't make a cowl yet. If, however, you use an easily deflectable material, wire is too stiff, and you'll find out why in the next slide, but I used stretch sprue, which is basically plastic polystyrene drawn on a flame to a consistent thickness. It was glued, bridging the gap from the square to the ring on the funnel. Here we go. We're making a hollowed out funnel cowl. The gaps between the sprue and also with the square were infilled with white glue. I use Evo Stick interior woodworking glue mixed about 50-50 with distilled water. And you can create all sorts of 3D effects, including canvas and also, in this case, making funnel cowls. The shrinkage and the deflection of the sprue made scale cowl shapes. Now, that great big shadow in the top left of the picture, with a little bit of blue tag, is my enormous fingers. The actual radio shack here was approximately 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch, but it was panelled. and I panelled it with small brass squares of different sizes, which were garnered from photo-etched lather stock, which is a consistent source of squares in various sizes from various scales. And the effect of the wood panelling in that small scale is really rather convincing. I despair over many model makers who mask and paint either brush or airbrush and end up with very fine models with fuzzy edges. This may be a heretic. However, I've devised all sorts of ways of getting razor sharp edges. Now, the demarcation of the black to the white to the red is explained in that image. I use full width, wide decal strip, expensive stuff in Germany, high quality, and overlay it after it's been varnished with a coat of varnish with red. So the red-white demarcation of the hull is razor sharp, far sharper than I've seen people in these small scales that I hasten to add achieve with masking and spraying and then having bleed. Likewise, the upper black lines in this construction photo can be seen demarcating the black, the white, the black, the white, which is very, very fussy if one were trying to do it with masking. But furthermore, trying to maintain parallel gaps when you're masking and then finding out that they weren't as parallel as you thought they might be, it's much easier using decal stripe because you can move it whilst it's wet and eyeball it from all angles. Now, I'm not infallible, and the method is not infallible, and the application of the black, white demarcations was repeated numerous times before I was happy. Now, aforementioned Radio Shack. The roof is made of brass, and then the edges, the beading of the edges of the overhang of the roof, which usually was, in this instance, was used to trap the canvas, is made of thin copper wire. Cutting exact lengths of very small wire in very small scale is an absolute fool's game because invariably it'll be the wrong length. As you can see, I've glued them on in echelon. Now doing that means I can achieve the correct position at the start, leaving it over length, and I snip it off with very sharp Fiskars curved scissors. I repeat the process in the other direction and end up with razor sharp corners, which I can then round off with a tiny bit of very light wet and dry sandpaper to achieve the curve that the real thing would have had. I infill the entirety of the roof afterwards with white glue, thin, there it goes again, and that then brings the beading and the top of the canvas level, deflected downwards ever so slightly. Here we have a picture of the vessel under construction, and I've annotated a few things. This is for a web presentation I did on modelwarships.com. However, you'll notice that the railings have canvas covers on them, and rather deliciously, against the light, you can see the outline of the railing with the canvas on top of it. The canvas would actually deflect into the railings when the ship was underway due to the apparent wind created of the ship's forward motion and or any other headwinds. Now, I've seen people using cigarette paper and all sorts of things, and it always looks a little bit fat and lumpy. We're coming back to white glue here. White glue can span with a rigger watercolorist paintbrush a aperture of about 1.5 inches when starting in a diagonal, drawing it across. The apertures needs are about a 1/16 at the best, so that's easy. But I also use white glue to create large canvas awnings on all sorts of scale model ships. So the idea, of course, is on different vessels where the railings might be painted black and the canvas, like an art ship, might be white. The trick is that white glue dries totally clear. As such, to make these canvas dodges on railings, I would paint the railings black first, then apply the white glue, and then paint the canvas on the outside only. That will give you razor sharp demarcation of railing versus canvas. You can see also in this photo, albeit fuzzy and out of focus, it was a point and shoot camera, already the enormous amounts of cowl vents sort of aft and ahead of the funnel, as well as various deck cowl vents as well. Triangular gussets at the bottom of the bridge supports were made of paper. Paper is a wonderful medium, especially in white, because it does not need multiple coats of paint. It can also be tacked on with matte varnish, thereby eliminating any sort of adhesive spillover. In particular, it's noteworthy that the brackets on this particular ship were reversed through 90 degrees from the bottom to the top of the bridge. The steering wheel is photo etched, and very nice it is too. The binnacle and the telegraph were scratch built in from little bits of rubbish. Okay, port side 3/4 aft view. The resolution's dropped a bit because it's a PowerPoint. However, you can see the enormously deep well deck. The well deck is enormously long, and it must be an absolutely horrid place to be trying to fire torpedoes in a seaway. Nevertheless, there it is. You will see that the catwalk that joins it together was made, well, you won't know this, but it was made of stainless steel. However, there was also a rail supporting it underneath, which would presumably be used as a rail for moving torpedoes around. That was made out of 0.5 by 0.5 angle, painted black on the inside, stuck to the bottom of the catwalk, and that then had white stretch sprue supports added. Although it is not absolutely correct as it would have been built, the effect is quite convincing and, very importantly, looks very much like it is in the photos. You can see the dodgers on the bridge from astern. You can see the extremely skinny handrails to the companionways coming down from the foredeck. In addition to which, you can see the very slim rails. Bear in mind this model is 9 inches long, and any larger fore and aft rails would show up drastically. So the trick is to get it almost, but not quite invisible. You'll notice that I've deflected the rails, i.e. the cables, because the frequently opened cables, presumably on Caribbean or similar fast fitting, between the davits would have been opened frequently, and therefore they would have not had that much tension. You can verify all this via various photos of the real thing. Should one want to... Now, the vessel that is slung inboard with a grey cover, that grey cover, once again, is made using white glue. I use a wire slightly curved strong back down the centre line of the ship's boat. I then infill the gaps with white glue. I put a tape around the edges for the skirt of the cover and paint the top surface slightly lighter than the vertical, i.e. light falls on top, it's darker in the shadow. The tie downs for these didn't have triangles on this particular vessel, and the tie downs are made of stretch sprue, which when pulled will hug exactly the shape of the hull and not be loose. It's a Royal Navy after all. The slung outboard whaler that can be seen, the seaboat, also has straps around it which follow the hull very closely. Now these were made out of stretch sprue of brown. However, I flattened it between two pieces of metal, so it no longer had a curved profile but was flat. And when it is attached, one can pull it nice and tight and shrink it with smoke. That's a whole other presentation about rigging later in the year. It's already been organized, so we'll get on with that later. The torpedo tubes are of interest because the actual tubes are splayed and not parallel. They were, you can't see it in this photograph, sadly, very closely, but the entire mounting bracket was incredibly complicated and was made out of slivers and snippets of brass. You'll notice the kick strip around the bottom of all the structures on the vessel. Again, I can't paint that well in small scale, but I can apply very thin bits of decal very, very accurately to give razor sharp demarcation from the black to the white. The side profile of the vessel illustrating very well the deep well deck connected by the catwalk fore and aft. The enormous amount of cowl vents, but also the significant number of boats she carried. From dead ahead, you can see the cowl vents but you can also see that they've been drilled vertically up through the shaft, as well as the open cowl mouth. In this scale, that is quite important because otherwise it would look daft if you had solid bottoms for the cowl vents. You can see the 4.7-inch gun, albeit overexposed, in the photo, and also the breakwater ahead of the forward gun, which has a round metal beading. So the forward breakwater was made of paper, and copper wire was added on the apex forward edge of the paper. That gives quite a convincing effect. The rigging on the entire vessel is made of stretch sprue and is probably just about in scale because you can barely see it, which would be about right. You'll notice the unusual shaped masts, which are near parallel pole masts and then have a sharply tapering tip. You'll be amused to know that I used extremely expensive Iwata airbrush needles for the masts. So they're probably the most expensive mast in Europe for a model ship. You can see the stern here and the enormously tall ensign staff, and that gives you an idea of scale. This was common, allegedly, because when the vessels were in a rough sea, when the stern dipped, you couldn't see the ensign. They had no gaff to fly the ensign from. As a result, the photographic proof that the ensign was flown off the ensign staff aft. The life rings down the side are made, very considerate of having life rings for the crew. They were made of copper wire, painted and then attached to the rail with matte varnish. The portholes have a porthole ring as well as eyebrows over them. You can't see them, unfortunately, in this photo. You can also see a small quick-firing gun, the name of which escapes me at the moment, on the port side aft below the slung outboard whaler seaboat. It is not a 27-foot whaler as we understand. It's a previous model and is rather beamier and has less shear line. You'll note on this particular boat, on the port side, as well as the one on the starboard side with the drop lines coiled, the coamings are made of timber. Now, again, I am not able to mask and paint something that carefully. However, again, I'm very good at putting tape on and then painting it afterwards to match, and it gives sharp demarcation. The rudder on the seaboat is made of paper attached with matte varnish, and as the varnish is drying, I drew it aft very slightly to give a small gap, so to simulate the distance between the gudgeons and the pintles. You'll notice the unusual stowage of the chain. Obviously, they hadn't sort of really worked out how to get the anchors into the horse pipes back then, so they had them on separate anchor beds, 2 on the starboard side, 1 on the port side. And the anchor chain was frapped up to be in between the 2 lines of black so as not to disturb the line. You can see just about, if you squint, the porthole rings and indeed the eyebrows. On the funnels, you can see ahead of it the 2 whistles serviced by a little platform and a ladder going down between the 2 cowl vents. It also illustrates quite nicely the cowls on the funnel, and below that, the outer ring that allows the air draft to assist, presumably, the evacuation of the fumes. Now, these vessels spent a lot of time at anchor, and as such, they used to rig awnings to keep the hot sun off, as well as rain. The awning stanchions on this class of vessel were, it seems, mostly permanently rigged and in place. The awning stanchions were made out of brass wire and supported with struts of brass wire and again rigged with stretch sprue. If you can't see it, it's probably the right scale. You'll notice that the door of the radio shack is open and there's a little chat going down between a rating and the radio operator. Similar thing, but looking from ahead. The chain is indeed chain. It's the smallest chain I've ever seen. It is, of course, not stud-link chain, but it does give a fairly convincing effect. The anchors were scratch built. I used paper for the anchor flutes, brass strip for the stock, and again, you can see the aperture in the bottom of the cowl vent. The turning rings were applied with wire on that. The searchlight I was very pleased with. I drilled it out, put a steel ring around the outside in wire, and then filled it up with white glue, which gives it enough density to appear, hopefully, convincing. On the port side of the bridge wing, you can see the chart box, which is an angled affair upon which you can put charts inside and not have them blow around over the extremely open and exposed bridge. You'll notice the officer on the near side of the starboard bridge has his hands open, has his hands up, should I say, holding binoculars to his eyes. The helmsman, of course, is a rating in white, and again, life rings on the forward face of the bridge. Now, the conning tower underneath, as in true combat operations, had slots, but they also had armored flaps that dropped over them with little hinges. These were simulated again with paper and pencil. You'll notice that quite a lot of the things, the lines, are demarked with pencil because it defines the edges of something that is painted white. If you paint something white in miniature, due to the thickness of paint and the limitations of our eyesight, one can't always see where the horizontal stops and the vertical starts. By putting a pencil line around it, then it gives a sharp demarcation line, which of course in real life doesn't exist, but this is a model after all. Going aft, same thing again. You have a small quick firing gun on a rotating mount. You have the twin torpedo mount aft. You can see the control wheels on the torpedo mount on the tubes. You have the boat strapped inboard onto the griping spar with the canvas pads. The canvas pads are best viewed on the forward boat with the drop lines. You can also see the canvas construction of the boat covers, again, strung back with white glue. The back of the 4.7 quick firing gun is detailed, but unfortunately out of focus in this image, but you can just about discern that on the aft image. The steps up the sides were made out of thin bits of stretched screw, and you notice there is a drop link without a lower cable for access to the stairs. The quick firing gun has an operating platform that was hinged, but was mostly left out. You can just see it. It has a tread plate pattern between the second and the third davit for the boats. The other side. I should have pointed out much earlier, of course, that the catwalk is offset from the center. You can see the various structures. They have skylights at the top, and the catwalk is outboard of that. Now, it must have been quite an amusing pastime on the real thing, trying to operate boats, board boats indeed, and then swing them outboard. But they obviously managed to do it quite successfully. In the extreme left, on the front funnel, you can just about see the sirens, which again were serviced by a platform. You can see various crew busying themselves, making themselves look busy, whilst probably doing not a great deal. I should say, viewing the coast perhaps. You'll notice that the aft vents by the aft of the aft funnel are splayed out and curved. They come up vertically through the superstructure, splay out at about 10 degrees off the vertical, and then straighten up almost in line with the lower funnel band. Interestingly, you can see the effect of the straps on the slung outboard whaler. These straps again are made of stretched screw. There's a coil rope forward, and the oars are laid across the thwarts for readiness. The stern view. The strange thing about these particular vessels, they appear to have rather more shear line than you would normally expect. Now, I doubted this very much, so I studied photos, I studied the plans, I made an overlay of the hull shear of the model, offered it up, and it looked right. In a foreshortened version, such as this, it looks a bit extreme, but I can assure you it is genuine. The catwalk, as you can see, also follows the shear line. That was a whole nother game for a whole nother presentation. I hope it's been useful, or indeed that you've gained some kind of insight into my obsessive nature. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed.